She braced herself. They were staring, whispering, laughing. The American soldiers had formed a loose line across the camp yard, rifles slung low, uniforms sharp, eyes unreadable. The young Japanese woman, no older than 19, clenched her fists at her sides as she stepped from the transport truck. Her kimono was torn. Her body ached. Her name she could not say out loud. Not any more. The girls around her were silent, all of them former comfort women, coerced into serving soldiers across occupied Asia. They had heard the rumors that if captured by Americans, they'd be dragged into another kind of brothel, that they knew why the girls were wanted. "We know why they want us," one whispered. But what came next wasn't violence. It was silence. A hand extended, not with force, but with a canteen of clean water, a blanket, a bar of soap. And then, for the first time in years, a door closed softly, not to trap them, but to give them privacy. What followed shattered everything they believed. She stood in line with the others, shoulders rigid, head low, her fingers digging into the fabric of the soiled kimono she had worn for too many weeks. The American guards were speaking, issuing orders, but she didn't understand the words. She understood tone, and this tone was not what she had expected. It wasn't barking, it wasn't amusement, it was bored, procedural, almost indifferent. One guard gestured toward a barrack, not with malice, but with routine. She didn't move, not until the girl behind her gently pushed her forward, whispering, "Go, just go." Her name had been erased months ago. They had given her a number in the camp at Luzon. Before that, she'd been called Kaori, but no one used it anymore. Even she avoided it. In the comfort station, names were dangerous. Names were promises. And promises broke. She had been taken when she was 17, not dragged, recruited, they said, for patriotic service. It was an honorable position, she had been told, serving the brave men of the Empire. There was a uniform, clean beds, food. Her village had been starving. Her mother had believed the lies because it was easier than the truth, that Kaori had been sold into captivity by men in her own army. At first it was just cleaning, carrying trays. Then came the orders to entertain. It was never a question, just a command. Her first customer was a drunken corporal. She had closed her eyes. The second had brought cigarettes and candy but left bruises on her thighs. By the third, she stopped resisting, stopped speaking, stopped being. By the time surrender came, Kaori had seen over 200 men. Her body was a vessel, her voice discarded somewhere in the jungles of Burma. When the Americans captured the station, she had tried to run, not to escape, but to force one of them to shoot her. But no bullets came, just the deafening silence of confusion. Now, standing inside the fenced perimeter of an American-run POW camp in the Philippines, Kaori's body still remembered how to flinch. When a soldier reached toward her, she recoiled, her mind already bracing for a blow, or worse. But the soldier only handed her a folded gray blanket. Nothing more. She stared at it like it was poisoned. Around her, the other girls were moving hesitantly into the barracks, glancing at the wooden beds, the clean floors. There were no ropes, no cages, no leering guards with cigarettes pressed between yellowed fingers. A girl named Fumiko broke the silence. "They haven't touched us." No one answered. Kaori sat on her assigned cot, the blanket clutched to her chest like armor. The silence felt louder than any scream. She scanned the room. 12 other women, all ex-comfort girls, all pretending not to cry. The training they had endured, the indoctrination, had been cruelly effective. They were told they were shame. Not just shamed, shame itself. That they could never go home. that if they were captured, they would be used until death. That Americans saw them as nothing more than meat, and in some part of their bones they had believed it. So when no hands came, no orders to undress, no dark cellars or locked doors, something inside them broke, not from violence, from the absence of it. Kaori lay on her side that night, eyes wide open, the blanket still untouched beneath her. The girl in the next cot, maybe 15, maybe 16, whimpered softly in her sleep. Kaori didn't reach out. She didn't know how. Outside, a harmonica played, a real one, a tune Kaori didn't recognize. It drifted across the yard like smoke, soft and slow, American music. Her body tensed, and then something happened she hadn't felt in years. Her jaw began to tremble, and tears slipped down her cheeks, not from pain, not from shame, but from confusion. What did it mean when your enemy didn't treat you like a thing? What did it mean when the monsters offered you silence instead of screams? What if the worst thing wasn't being broken, but being allowed to heal? Kaori could not sleep, not because of fear, but because the bed was too soft. It creaked under her weight with each breath, as if startled to have her there. The blanket was coarse but clean. She had not smelled soap in months, not real soap, and now it clung to her skin like an accusation. Her body, used to concrete floors and bare bamboo mats, could not understand this sudden gentleness. Every softness felt like a trap. At sunrise, the door clicked open. A guard called for roll, his voice steady, not raised. He did not leer, did not stare. The women filed out, still wrapped in silence, their faces blank. The sun was already warm, and the grass that edged the compound looked like it had been trimmed. Kaori kept her eyes on the dirt. She was used to looking down. They were not strip-searched. They were not questioned with hands or fists. Instead, a clipboard passed between guards. Numbers were read. Some were mispronounced. No one was hit for it. Inside the mess hall, trays were handed to them one by one. Kaori reached for hers with both hands, trembling. The tray was warm. Eggs, bread, something steaming in a bowl. She could not name it. She did not know how to eat it without flinching. A woman at the end of the table, Hana, her name might have been, picked up a slice of bread and stared at it. "This must be a joke," she whispered. "They want us weak, soft, so they can—" She didn't finish the sentence. No one had to. Kaori forced the bread into her mouth. Her teeth sank into the crust, and for a moment her body remembered hunger more than her mind did. She chewed slowly, almost reverently, trying not to taste it too much. Good food could become dangerous. It made you feel again. The room was quiet, too quiet. The guards didn't bark orders. They didn't pace or shout. One sat near the wall, scribbling something into a notebook. Another leaned against the doorframe, sipping from a tin cup, eyes distant. They looked like men waiting for a train, not enemies keeping watch. That afternoon, the women were given towels, told they could wash. Kaori held the towel in her hands and stared at the clean edges. It reminded her of a memory she didn't want, of being 16, drying her hands after helping her mother prepare rice. Before everything changed. In the showers, no one watched them. The guards stood outside. The room smelled of steam and something floral. Kaori hesitated before undressing. Her body no longer felt like hers. The others undressed in silence, bruises fading into yellow under the light. Hot water hit her skin. It was too much, too good. She leaned against the wall, tears rising without permission. She wasn't crying because it hurt. She was crying because it didn't. Later that night in the barracks, someone laughed. Just once. Short, bitter. "They want us to think this is real," the voice said. "It's not. They'll break us later. They're just waiting." Kaori said nothing, but in her stomach a knot tightened. What if the kindness was a trick? What if this peace was just the inhale before the blow? Or worse, what if it wasn't? What if they were being treated like people because they were people? That thought terrified her most, because if it was true, then everything they had endured, the silence, the degradation, the shame, had not been inevitable. It had been a choice made by men who wore their own flag. Kaori curled into the cot, the blanket pulled over her mouth, her breath warm against the fabric. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of pain. She was afraid of dignity, because she didn't believe she deserved it. So when the nurse entered the room, Kaori couldn't look her in the eye. The woman was American, mid-30s perhaps, with hair tied back under a starched cap, and a face that wore neither pity nor revulsion, only calm, steady focus. She carried no weapon, just a canvas medical satchel slung over one shoulder. In another life, before Kaori knew the price of obedience, she might have resembled the older women from her village, firm, practical, the kind who mended shirts and spoke with authority. But here, in this place, the presence of a woman in uniform meant something entirely different. "Who's first?" the nurse asked in soft, careful Japanese. No one moved. Silence tightened around the barracks like rope. Fumiko rose finally, slow and stiff, arms folded across her chest as if she could hold herself together with pressure alone. The others watched as she was led outside, toward the makeshift clinic that had been set up in a tent near the mess hall. Kaori waited, her stomach knotted, every passing minute another turn of the screw. Fumiko returned eventually, her wrist bound with fresh gauze, her mouth clamped shut. She didn't speak, just sat and stared at the floor, her fingers resting lightly on the clean bandage, like she wasn't sure it belonged to her. Kaori was the last to go. Inside the clinic, she perched on a small wooden stool. Her arms remained at her sides, rigid and still. The nurse crouched to examine an old rope burn around Kaori's ankle, a mark from the days when escape wasn't just feared, but forbidden. "I'm going to touch you now," the nurse said gently. The words were meant to reassure, but Kaori flinched anyway the moment she felt fingers on her skin. She didn't mean to. Her body moved before her mind could stop it. The nurse froze, then pulled back. "Okay," she murmured, in a voice so calm it was almost a whisper. "Slow? We go slow." She cleaned the wound with a cloth soaked in warm water. The sting was minor, barely noticeable, but Kaori's eyes blurred with tears. Not from pain, from something she couldn't name. She held her breath and stared at the canvas wall of the tent. No one had touched her like this in years, without expectation, without disgust, without taking something from her. The nurse said nothing else, didn't ask questions, didn't prod. When it was over, Kaori stood to leave, ready to vanish back into silence. But the nurse stopped her. She reached into a box and handed Kaori something small, wrapped in clean paper. A toothbrush. Kaori stared at it, confused. "It's for you," the nurse said. "Your own." The words barely registered. Kaori took it as if it might explode in her hands. Her fingers were numb. In the station, there had been no toothbrushes, no soap, no need. Hygiene was a luxury reserved for those who mattered. She carried the toothbrush back to the barracks like a relic. She didn't unwrap it. She sat on her cot, holding it, trying to remember the last time she had something that was hers. She couldn't. Across the room, Emiko rocked on her heels, knees to her chest, face hidden in the curve of her arms. She hadn't spoken since they arrived. Kaori hadn't heard her voice. Fumiko whispered that she hadn't said her name in weeks. Kaori understood. Names meant you existed, and to exist, to admit you were a person, was dangerous when your body had been treated like a tool. Kaori hadn't said her name either, not even to herself. That night, Emiko made a sound, a quiet sob, barely audible, when one of the guards returned and, without a word, placed a second toothbrush on her cot. She didn't use it. She didn't even unwrap it. But she held it close, curling around it like it was something fragile. None of them said aloud what they were all thinking, that this couldn't last, that tomorrow the food might vanish, the kindness might turn. They had been conditioned to believe nothing good came without a price, but a new kind of war was taking shape inside them, and it was quieter, more treacherous than the one they had escaped. It was the war of being seen, the war of being offered dignity they did not believe they were allowed to feel. And sometimes the sharpest pain did not come from fists or forced hands. It came from something gently offered and impossibly kind, like a toothbrush laid quietly on a cot and left without explanation. A few mornings later the guards entered with a stack of paper and a small tin filled with pencils. No fanfare, no speeches, just a quiet announcement in broken Japanese. They could write letters, to home, to family. Kaori stared at the paper like it had grown teeth. Around her, the room froze. The very word, letter, felt like something from a past life, from school days, from before shame had a face. The guards laid the supplies on a table and walked away, leaving the women to sort through the possibility like it was too dangerous to touch. Kaori waited until the others moved first. Fumiko sat at the edge of her cot, with a pencil between her fingers, unmoving. Emiko, still silent but steadier now, took a sheet and held it to her chest. Kaori took one too, slow and careful, and returned to her bunk. She placed it on her lap, stared at the blankness. It was not just paper, it was something worse, a battlefield, a test of memory, a mirror she didn't want to look into. What could she possibly write to the mother she had left behind, the one who had kissed her forehead and told her to serve well? Would her mother even want to hear from her? Would she believe her daughter had lived, had survived, not through heroism or sacrifice, but because an American nurse had cleaned her wounds and handed her a toothbrush? The words refused to come, not because there was nothing to say, but because there was too much. If she told the truth, that she had been made a comfort girl, that her name had been erased, that American soldiers had fed her and treated her like a person, she would be branded a traitor. Not just by the warlords of the empire, but by the very soil she came from. Others tried. A girl named Noriko began to write in short, stilted sentences. I am alive. I eat 3 times a day. They gave me soap. Then she stopped, her eyes wide. They'll read it, she whispered. In Tokyo, the censors, they'll know. Kaori didn't need to ask who they were. Everyone knew. Letters from POW camps didn't pass untouched. Every word was a risk. A misplaced sentence could mean a family shamed, or worse, a mother arrested, a brother sent to the front. That blank page could betray more than it revealed. Still, Kaori picked up the pencil. Her fingers trembled. She wrote one word, mother, and then stopped. Her breath hitched. She hadn't spoken it aloud in years. Eventually, slowly, she wrote, I am alive. I am not hurt. The Americans feed us. We sleep in beds. I do not understand this war anymore. She stared at it for a long time. Not because it was perfect. It wasn't. But because it felt like a confession. She folded the letter and placed it on the pile the guards would collect. She didn't sign her name, only her number. Weeks passed before word returned. Some letters had reached their destinations, others had been intercepted. Rumors spread. that the Japanese military was opening them, analyzing them, filing them away under moral corruption. Kaori's letter never came back, but she began to notice things. A guard, Japanese-American, fluent in both languages, passed her one day and said softly, "Your mother will be proud." She hadn't told him anything. She hadn't spoken to him at all. But the way he looked at her, gently, without expectation, told her enough. The others kept writing, not because they believed the letters would arrive, but because it reminded them that there was still someone out there to write to. The pencil became a weapon, the paper a battlefield they could finally win, because in a world that had stripped them of their voice, every word on that page was an act of rebellion and an act of remembering who they once were. When the guards told them they would be allowed to bathe, truly bathe, the women didn't react at first. The words were too strange to be understood in the way they were meant. "Showers," they said, "hot water, towels, soap." The women nodded as if complying with an order, not recognizing it as a gift. It wasn't until they were led into a separate wooden building, recently built, with a heavy door that locked from the inside, that something shifted in the air. It was the smell. Clean water, steam, and not a single voice shouting commands. Kaori stepped inside slowly. The room was warm, humming with moisture. Tiled floors, freshly scrubbed. No drains clogged with filth. No boots thudding past the door. Just towels folded neatly on a bench, bars of soap wrapped in wax paper, and the silence of no one watching. That silence was the loudest thing she had heard in months. The others moved like shadows, hesitant. A few unwrapped the soap and held it to their noses, eyes wide. One girl, barely 17, gagged suddenly and vomited into a corner. The smell of lavender, of safety, had struck her like a memory she didn't know she still carried. Fumiko knelt beside her, whispering comfort. Kaori undressed with trembling fingers, the gesture mechanical. Her body had never been her own. It had been on display, used, evaluated. She half expected someone to burst in, a correctional officer, a superior officer, anyone, but no one came. The door was shut, locked from the inside. A lock meant protection, not prison. That realization sent a jolt through her chest. She stepped beneath the stream of hot water, and her knees nearly gave. The water hit her like grief. It was too warm, too safe, too human. Her arms hugged her own body instinctively. She hadn't been clean, truly clean, in years. Dirt had become armor. Now, as the filth sloughed off her skin, it felt like part of her was being peeled away. Layers of her old life dissolved into the drain, and what was left behind felt alien. Nakedness without shame, vulnerability without threat. The soap was rough at first, then smooth. She lathered her arms slowly, watching as the water turned gray, then clear. Her hands shook as she washed her neck. She reached for her hair, long, tangled, and began to scrub. The scent filled the room. Another girl began to cry quietly, not from pain, but from some deeper wound that had finally been reached. Another fell to her knees under the spray and whispered something between sobs. A name. Maybe a prayer. Kaori turned off the water. She stood dripping, her breath uneven. She didn't want to move. She didn't want to feel what she was feeling. That being clean, something so simple, could feel like betrayal. Because if she was clean, if she could smell like soap, then maybe she wasn't what they told her she was. And that was terrifying. She found the mirror by accident, a small one, hung crooked above the sink. She hadn't seen her reflection in over 2 years. She approached it cautiously, towel wrapped tightly around her body. For a moment, she saw only the outline, the sunken cheeks, the hollow eyes, the long dark hair. Then she looked closer and saw herself. Not a number, not a comfort girl, not a body for others, just a woman. Her lip trembled. She touched the glass as if to confirm that it was real. Outside the showers, the sun had risen higher. The camp moved in quiet rhythms. Guards rotated. Meals were prepared. But inside that small building, something had happened that no one would ever write down. The war inside them had shifted again. Because sometimes healing didn't come like thunder. Sometimes it came like hot water, like a folded towel, like the sound of soap being unwrapped by hands that had forgotten softness. And in that moment, they were more than survivors. They were becoming whole. The next morning brought something else unexpected. A sergeant, young, with sunburned cheeks and a clumsy command of Japanese, walked into the center of the compound holding a small canvas bag. Inside were seeds. He knelt by a patch of cleared earth near the edge of the fencing, gestured to the ground, and in halting syllables said, "You can grow something." The women watched from a distance, unsure what to make of the offering. A garden? In a place like this? The notion felt absurd. Yet there he was, fingers in the soil, pressing a small seed into place like it mattered. By afternoon, a handful of women had approached the patch. They stood around it in silence, as if looking at a grave. And in a way, they were. A burial for everything they had been told they were, and a question they had never been allowed to ask. What now? Kaori found herself kneeling by the garden the next morning. She didn't know the names of the plants. No one did, but their leaves were tender, trembling slightly in the breeze. She pressed her palms to the earth, feeling its warmth. It reminded her of home, of her grandfather's rice fields, of muddy toes and laughter from another life. She scooped the soil carefully, pressing seeds into small furrows, covering them again with loose dirt. Around her, others did the same. No orders were given, no guards stood watch. It was as if this moment existed outside of war. Within days, that small act of planting became part of a quiet routine. In the mornings, they watered. In the evenings, they checked for growth. Slowly, something began to change in the rhythm of the camp. A new world, cautious and still tender, began to take form. There were new duties, sweeping the mess hall, folding laundry, helping in the kitchen. These tasks weren't punishments. They were jobs, purposeful, done with dignity. Fumiko, who once trembled at the sight of a soldier's boots, now stirred rice with calm, steady hands, her apron dusted with flour. Emiko helped organize supplies in the infirmary, learning the names of medicines, shadowing the nurse who had once tended her. Kaori, fluent in both Japanese and some English from her early schooling, was asked to translate between the guards and the women. At first, her voice was barely audible, but with each day, her words grew more confident. She wasn't speaking because she had to. She was speaking because her voice had value. She began keeping track of names, organizing requests, bridging confusion with clarity. She stopped fearing her own fluency. This wasn't service. It wasn't forced obedience. It was something far more radical: agency, the ability to choose, the chance to give rather than be taken from. The difference was subtle, but profound. Some evenings, after chores and meals, the women would gather near the garden. The sprouts had begun to emerge, small green shoots, fragile but alive. They'd sit on crates or crouch in the dirt, speaking in low voices. Not about the past. The past was still too heavy, but about small things, what the plants might grow into, how they would taste, whether there'd be flowers, whether birds would come. And sometimes there was laughter, not loud, not unburdened, but real. the kind that slips through when your guard is down. Kaori began to write again, not to her mother, not yet, but in a notebook the nurse had given her. She wrote down what was planted, how long it took to sprout, who watered it last, and slowly, almost without realizing, she started writing stories, imagined futures for each of them. One about Fumiko running a bakery, one about Emiko becoming a teacher, one about herself, walking freely in a garden that needed no barbed wire. Because maybe, just maybe, if life could grow here, in this wounded soil, in this place of ghosts, then so could they. It began with a scratchy sound, barely noticeable at first, a gentle hiss, then the flutter of brass and cymbals rising from the mess hall like a strange scent in the wind. Kaori looked up from the laundry line, her hands mid-fold. The others paused too, their bodies stiffening all at once, as if someone had shouted. But no one had. There were no boots, no commands, only the low, rolling rhythm of something soft, meandering, and foreign. It was music. The women moved toward the sound, unsure if they were allowed to listen, unsure if they even wanted to. Jazz, the Americans called it, a kind of music that bent notes and refused order. Playful, spontaneous, strange. In the room, a phonograph spun slowly, its needle wobbling with each crackle. An American guard leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes half closed. He wasn't watching anyone. He was just listening. Kaori stood in the doorway. The melody curled through the air, light and bright. She felt her chest tighten. Somewhere, long ago, she had heard a tune like this. In a cafe near the harbor, back when she still wore school uniforms and laughed without flinching. Before the uniform, before the silence. And just like that, it came back, her father tapping his foot beneath the table, her mother's fingers drumming against a teacup. The memory opened like a wound. Fumiko stepped inside first. No one stopped her. The others followed, some clutching their arms, some with hands pressed to their mouths. The music continued. Then something happened. Emiko, still barely speaking, began to hum, softly. A breath at first, then a sound. She didn't seem to realize she was doing it. Her eyes stayed locked on the spinning record, but the tune slipped from her lips like it had been waiting all this time. Kaori watched her, stunned. No one moved to hush her. No one reached to pull her away. Instead, something shifted in the air. One of the American nurses, sitting at a corner table, began tapping the beat on the wood with 2 fingers. Another guard smiled, his eyes meeting no one in particular. For a moment, the room was not a prison, not a camp. It was a shared space, a strange, quiet bridge across a chasm none of them had words for. But then the tears came. Noriko, usually the loudest of them, covered her face and wept. Her shoulders shook as she folded in on herself. Kaori moved to her side, wrapped an arm around her without a word. The music kept playing, oblivious to the breakdown, the memory, the ache it had unearthed. That was the thing about music. It didn't ask for permission. It slipped under the skin, found what had been hidden, and brought it to the surface. Later, when the record ended and the room returned to its quiet hum, no one spoke. There was no need. They had heard something that didn't belong in a place like this, and somehow that made it more powerful, because music for so long had been a tool of command. Marches, drums, chants, all used to synchronize, to erase the self, to dominate. But this was different. This was music for no reason, no purpose except to be beautiful. That night, Kaori sat on her bunk and wrote in her notebook, "Today I remembered my father, not because of a smell or a word, but because of sound." And I think I smiled. In the days that followed, the guards played the record again, not every night, just sometimes, enough that it became a kind of ritual, fragile, quiet, understood by everyone, and explained by no one. It was a moment they shared not as prisoners and captors, but as people who had lived through things none of them could fully name. And in those few minutes, as the jazz floated on the air like smoke from a fire long extinguished, they remembered who they were and who they might still become. The lessons began quietly, almost shyly, as though the Americans themselves weren't sure whether teaching prisoners how to read and write made sense. Yet one morning a chalkboard appeared in the corner of the mess hall, propped crookedly against a stack of crates. A young lieutenant, barely more than a boy, stood beside it, holding a box of chalk in one hand and a thin English primer in the other. He looked terrified. The women looked worse. None of them had expected this. They had expected more work, more silence, more routine. But a classroom? Kaori approached with the others, each step cautious. On the surface it seemed harmless. Words, letters, sounds. But language was power, and for years their voices had been taken, bent, ordered, silenced. Now they were being handed a chance to speak again, in a tongue not their own, by men they had been told were monsters. It felt dangerous. The lieutenant wrote the first word slowly. Freedom. The chalk squeaked. The women flinched. The sound reminded them of boots scraping against wooden floors, of doors slamming shut. But the lieutenant stepped aside, gesturing for one of them to come forward. It was Emiko who moved, still quiet, still fragile, but bolder now in the way a wounded bird might test its wings. She took the chalk, her fingers trembling, and traced each letter. She didn't know what the word meant, not fully, but she felt something in it. A space opening, a breath filling her lungs. She stepped back, staring at the word as if it were a doorway she wasn't sure she could walk through. Lessons unfolded slowly from there. English phrases, numbers, simple sentences. The women repeated after the lieutenant, their accents thick, their voices unsteady, but each sound that came out of their mouths was theirs, not commanded, not forced. Language became a small rebellion, a reclaiming of the right to speak. Kaori took to the lessons quickly. Words had always lived easily on her tongue, even before the war had swallowed her voice. She translated for the others, helping them form syllables, guiding them gently. She didn't recognize herself at first. Confidence felt foreign. But with each passing day, her spine straightened, her tone steadied, and her voice began to carry its old warmth again. Books followed the lessons, thin pamphlets first, then slightly thicker ones about governments, rights, and histories she had never been taught. Words like democracy and dignity made her uneasy. They felt like accusations. The more she read, the more she understood how deeply she had been betrayed, not by the Americans, but by the men who told her she existed only to serve. Many of the women struggled with this revelation. It was easier sometimes to hate the enemy than to question the homeland. Kaori watched as Fumiko shut a book with trembling hands, whispering, "If this is true, what does that make us?" No one answered. The truth sat heavy in the room. Meanwhile, letters from Japan arrived sporadically. They were thinner now, more desperate. Food was scarce, homes were crumbling, mothers begged for news, brothers pleaded for hope. The women wept privately over each letter, torn between gratitude for their safety and guilt for receiving so much when their homeland had so little. Kaori tried to write back, but her hand froze above the page. How could she say she was fed 3 times a day? How could she say she had a bed, a garden, lessons. The ink blurred as her tears fell onto the page, yet she wrote anyway, because silence was its own cruelty. She wrote carefully, choosing each word like a fragile seed that might either bloom or wither. She imagined her mother's hands holding the letter, imagined her reading the soft, deliberate script. It was the only thing she could offer, and maybe one day it would be enough. A hunger grew in them now, not for food, but for meaning, for truth, for the possibility of a life beyond survival. If you've been moved by this story so far, please like the video and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. The next gift wasn't wrapped. It was handed to Kaori by the same nurse who had once given her a toothbrush. No ceremony, no explanation, just a quiet moment and a small rectangular mirror, the kind with a wooden handle and smudged edges. For a second, Kaori didn't know what it was. She'd seen glass, reflections in puddles or polished boots, but not her face, not truly, not since before the brothel, before the surrender, before everything had been broken. She stared at it as if it might burn her. When she finally raised it to her face, the breath left her lungs. What stared back wasn't a comfort girl. It wasn't a prisoner either. Her cheeks were fuller now. Her hair was no longer matted or crudely hacked, but brushed and tied back. Her skin, once ashen and bruised, held a soft flush from the sun. But it wasn't the physical transformation that made her hand tremble. It was the eyes. They looked back with something she didn't expect: recognition. Other girls were handed mirrors, too. Not all at once, but quietly, as if these weren't supplies, but secrets. Fumiko gasped when she saw herself, dropping the mirror before catching it with both hands. Emiko held hers to her chest and wouldn't speak for the rest of the day. These weren't just objects. They were confirmations, proof that they were still there, beneath the layers of dirt, silence, and shame. But the transformation brought questions none of them were prepared to answer. Who were they now, really? For so long they had been told who they were: comfort girls, expendable property of the Empire. Their identity had been something imposed, not chosen. Now, with the war over and their bodies beginning to heal, the question returned like an old wound. If I am not what they said I was, then what am I? Kaori tried to put it into words in her notebook, but language failed her. Some days she felt like a ghost pretending to be human. Other days she felt like a child learning to walk for the first time. The myth that had shaped her, that her worth was bound to loyalty, to sacrifice, to silence, had begun to crack. But myths don't die quietly. They haunt. One afternoon a new rumor passed through the camp. It came from one of the interpreters assigned to monitor radio transmissions. Japanese soldiers, they said, had begun to surrender more easily. Some had heard stories of how POWs, even former comfort girls, were being treated, that they were clothed, fed, protected, that they were allowed to write letters, learn English, listen to music. The idea spread like wildfire through the Allied lines. If this was how the enemy treated prisoners, perhaps surrender wasn't shameful after all. The irony was sharp and bitter. These women, once discarded by their own commanders, violated, erased, were now part of what softened the war's final edge. Their survival, their presence, their voices had become a kind of proof that mercy existed. Kaori didn't know how to feel about that. She stood at the fence line one evening, mirror in hand, watching the garden as it shifted with the breeze. The plants were tall now, green and thriving. The jazz record played faintly from the mess hall behind her. In the mirror, she saw the outline of her face, lit by the lowering sun. She looked again, longer this time, not as a stranger, not as a soldier's possession, as herself, and somewhere inside, something ancient and cruel was giving way, not quickly, not cleanly, but enough to make room for a future, one she might get to choose. They were told on a Wednesday. Repatriation. The word sounded clinical, almost sterile, a technical term for something that split their hearts down the middle. They were going home. But what was home now? A country in rubble? A silence waiting to swallow them again? Or worse, a place where no one would believe what they had seen, what they had survived. The journey was quiet. They boarded American ships in small groups, carrying only what they could hold. Kaori clutched her notebook like a talisman. Fumiko kept her mirror hidden in a cloth pouch. Emiko wore the same pair of soft canvas shoes she'd been given in the camp, worn down but clean. As the ship pulled away, none of them waved. None of them spoke. It felt too large a moment for words. When they arrived in Japan, there were no crowds, no cheers, only officials with clipboards and eyes that wouldn't meet theirs. A few of the women were pulled aside for questioning. Their American-acquired clothes drew sneers. Their improved health drew suspicion. One official muttered the word Yankee whores under his breath. Kaori didn't flinch. The records had already been rewritten. The comfort stations were never official. Their service never recognized. Their pain never documented. They were not heroes. They were not even victims. They were stains, shameful reminders of a war lost and a dignity crumbled. And now they were back, walking reminders of everything the nation wanted to forget. Most of them were told to keep quiet. Some were warned outright. Speak of the Americans and you'll bring shame to your family. The kindness they had received, the music, the books, the mirrors, became a kind of poison in the eyes of their own people. Mercy, it turned out, had no place in a country still trying to mourn with pride. Kaori returned to a neighborhood she barely recognized. Her house was gone. Her mother, she learned, had died the year before. Her brother had never come home from the Philippines. She was taken in by a distant aunt who kept her at arm's length. The air was thick with judgment, spoken and unspoken. Every kindness she tried to offer was met with suspicion. She was not seen as a survivor. She was seen as a betrayal. And yet something inside her had changed. She no longer walked with her eyes to the ground. She no longer believed the silence. The hunger that had begun in that camp, not for food, but for meaning, stayed with her. She began to teach neighborhood children how to read. She grew vegetables in a small corner of scorched soil. She hummed jazz beneath her breath when no one was listening. Fumiko disappeared into the countryside. Emiko was said to have married a teacher in Kyoto. None of them stayed in touch. It would have been dangerous. But sometimes, when Kaori passed the post office, she imagined them writing letters they would never send, reading books with corners dog-eared from years of turning, planting seeds no one knew about. One evening, Kaori sat alone on her small veranda. The sun was low, casting gold across the broken streets. She opened her notebook, the same one she'd carried from the camp, and turned to a page dated months ago, a letter she'd written but never mailed. She read the words aloud softly, tasting them again. The ink had faded. The meaning had not. I am alive, and I matter. She closed the notebook, smiled. She didn't need anyone to believe her story anymore. She believed it, and that was enough. If this story stayed with you, please like this video and leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and what part of the story struck you most.